one thing that your book taught me, and we can actually start to get into this right now, is there are so many misconceptions about koalas that I didn't even realize were misconceptions. I was just so ignorant and naive about the species just because that's just what we've always said about this is how koalas live. This is how they are. This is their behavior. This is what they do. And your book definitely showed me otherwise. So, could you talk a little bit more about that? Maybe give us like the koala 101 about them, why they're unique. You even like went through their natural history and their evolution and all kinds of stuff. But could you just almost spew on us koalas and the 101 on them?
Yeah, well, I guess, the perception that koalas are very simple and straightforward animals, um, and I mean, koalas are one of the most well-known and famous conservation species in the world, in actual fact. So there is a lot of politics around koalas, and that, they receive a huge amount of conservation money, and, they are iconic in the sense that, a bit like being the poster child for conservation in some ways for, like a panda or polar bears or those sorts of iconic animals. So it is a really big issue in conservation, and of course it's confusing for a lot of biologists because biologists will say, well, koalas aren't as a species anywhere near endangered. They are actually exceedingly common in the southern forests of Australia, but they are endangered and seem to be going extinct in the east coast forest to the north. So, which is where people are worried about them. So there's this kind of complication around koalas. And I guess I'm very wary of the stories we tell about species and well, actually any stories. It's part of the thing I like to do with my books is to really unpack what are the stories we tell, why do we tell those stories, and what's the truth, what's real, what's it got an evidence base for it. So I'll often want to go back to the archives and double check everything. But in the case of koalas, I had to use a real wide range of scientific evidence to try and unpack them. So that's, I start the book in the fossil history because I think we see koalas as this singular species, unlike anything else. Uh, but it's always useful to know what their family history is. And if we go back into the fossil record, we find there's a whole range of different species that have extinct that koalas are related to. And we get a much better sense of what kind of an animal they are if you look at what their close relatives are. So they're not as singular. I mean, they are still pretty singular, but they're not as isolated as we think of them. And it's important to try and get away from that idea. Well, I mean, look at that idea about them being the last of their kind, because we have a tendency to blame animals for their own extinction. We'll say like the panda is stupid, maladapted, has a really dumb diet, and is going extinct because it can't breed properly. Um, and we have the same narrative with koalas in some ways, even though we can love it to death. We'll still say it's slow, it's stupid, it has a dumb diet, it eats toxic leaves, and it's doomed to extinction. So this idea of being doomed to extinction has been going on for as long as Europeans and settlers have been talking about koalas. And I don't think that's true at all because they're actually extremely resilient animals. They have bounced back from extinction at least twice, near extinction, of course, at least twice that we know of, and once very recently with hunting of koalas in Australia, and before that with the great megafauna extinction that wiped out a lot of the Ice Age animals. So koalas suffered from a huge extinction event, near extinction event then too. So, they're a really so they're a really resilient species, and I think that was the interesting thing for me to look at is how that came about. And in the process of unpacking that, of course, I unpacked a whole heap of really amazing information around how koalas are so well adapted for um, the trees they live in specifically. So the coevolution of eucalypts and koalas is a really incredible story, and I think that really helps us to understand exactly what's going on with them, why they're difficult to breed, why they need so much space, all of those sorts of things.
Yeah, because I was not aware, like, just how picky they are, and you went into fantastic depth about their microbiomes and how specific they are, and having to get, oh, what did you call it? That special almost like poo formula that babies need from their mother to get the biome to be able to even digest these leaves. But yeah, for maybe those of us that don't know much about eucalyptus, the family that these koalas love to eat, could you maybe explain a little bit more about them and why are they so difficult to eat, and why is the koala like pretty much one of the only species that feeds almost exclusively on them?
Yeah, yeah. So typically, when we think about eucalyptus trees, we think of them as just a singular tree, singular type of tree, the eucalyptus. But of course, they're a really large and diverse family of tree or group of trees. There's, almost 900 species and subspecies of eucalypts. Most of them are from Australia, so they're very, very specific to Australia. Although, of course, everybody's familiar with them because they've been one of the most, they're sort of a reverse colonizer. We've actually sent eucalypts off into the world, and they are one of the most widespread planted trees now, elsewhere, hardwoods certainly in the world. So, so most people are familiar with them in America, in China, in Europe, all those sorts of places. And they are very characteristic. The
Oh,
leaf
yeah,
is
some.
quite thick and tough. I raced outside this morning to go and grab some leaves off the trees because I'm surrounded by eucalypts. And that's the interesting thing, of course, that we think of eucalypts as being something strange and unusual, but in Australia, they are the dominant forest. So our great forest estate is nearly always dominated by eucalypts. So they're a really, really common type of tree. But they do have these very tough, these are actually regrowth, so they're a little bit softer than many of them are, but they're quite leathery, hard leaves. And if you crush them, they've got a very powerful smell because they're full of the eucalypt oils. So eating them takes it's quite a struggle to eat them. They're very fibrous, and mammals can't digest cellulose and lignin in plant matter themselves. So most herbivores have really complex stomachs to in order to digest this very fibrous plant material. So that's whether they're eating grass or leaves or whatever it is they're eating. So koalas don't have really complex stomachs, but what they do have is a really large. It's called a cecum, and it's the equivalent of the appendix in humans. So while our appendix is very residual and it's only about the size of your thumb, the koala cecum is almost 2 meters long. So it's a huge thing for a small animal to have.
Yeah.
And it's like basically what it is like a pouch. So a big pocket in the digestive system that's full of a microbial soup. And it's the microbes that herbivores use to digest the cellulose and lignin in the leaves and in grass as well. So the koala chews up all the leaves. The fine particles are diverted into the cecum, into this soup where they'll stay for several days, a week, to have all the nutrients digested and be broken down by the bacteria and other microbes. And the large particles will be swept, through the normal digestive system it popped out the other end. So so that's the basic thing, but then, of course, there are the toxins that are, in the leaves. So koalas have to have a way of dealing with those toxins, and a lot of the toxins in eucalypts actually make mammals feel nauseous. So they create nausea in the animals. So they'll eat a little bit of it, and then they'll say, "Oh, no more of that, thank you." So koalas deal with this in part with their liver. They have a supercharged liver that's quite large and complex, in its structure, and it seems to have a double dose of genes for removing toxins from eucalypts. And they're so good at removing toxins that they are actually also really good at removing things like medicine from their system. So it's really hard to treat koalas for diseases because not only do they have this liver that removes all the toxins, but of course also some of those medicines will also really disrupt their microbial system, which ends up meaning that they don't eat. So, yeah, a good example of that is the treatment of chlamydia, which koalas suffer from quite a lot, particularly on the East Coast. And a normal dose of for chlamydia in humans would be a 3-day dose of antibiotics. In koalas, that will be a 30-day dose to clear up that
Crazy.
disease. So, that just gives you an idea of how powerful that liver is. So yeah, getting hold of all those nutrients in leaves is a really tight struggle. They've got really complex proteins that are really hard to extract, and this is something that was a real struggle for me to come to grips with. It's not my area of expertise, but the sometimes they can actually, when they eat some of the leaves on some species of eucalypts, they can eat the leaves and actually end up with less nutrition than they started with. So it's so hard for the leaves are so complex and resist being processed so much that they actually extract nutrients out of the koala rather than the other way around. So it's really, really important that the koala gets it right, which ones they eat. So for that reason, koalas only eat about 70 species of eucalypts across Australia, and any one koala will only eat between 4 and 10 species that are found in their area. And it's quite probable that their microbiome is specifically adapted to those individual species that it's familiar with. And as you mentioned, they get those microbes. They're not born with the microbes. They don't have them in their gut when they're young, when they're milk feeding. But at some point, as they're developing, the mother will actually evacuate her cecum. So she'll empty a big dose of that microbial soup from her cecum, and it comes out as this runny green pap. And the baby koala laps that up, absolutely loves it. It's a big disgusting mess when this happens. um, but that inoculates the koala, that baby, the joey, with the right microbiome for its forest, the forest that it lives in. So it means that as soon as it gets that, it can start eating gum leaves, which before it doesn't eat them at all. It have a bit of a chew and a play with them, but it won't eat them. So it's a really fascinating system. This way, the mother inoculates the baby with exactly the right biome, and you might think that's a strange and bit disgusting thing to do, but in actual fact, we're increasingly understanding that microbiomes are really important for our own health, for probably most animals' health, and even in humans. There's an element of fecal contamination during the birth process that gives us our gut biome as well. So we do a very similar thing. And humans that have lost their gut biome through massive antibiotic courses and things are also inoculated, and not in the same way, but also they do the same thing in hospitals. They don't like talking about it very much, but but the same process is used in humans as well.
Yeah, I come from a family of all ladies. And so the whole childbirth process, I'm very used to that. And, having a vaginal birth versus a C section, they've come to show that there are consequences for the baby. So, yeah, I'm not surprised that this is how a baby Joey would get the proper microbiome to the ecosystem that it lives in. Because how else would it get it? Like, how else are that very special soup essentially that is the species that will break down the leaves that they eat, how else are they going to get that? So it just makes sense that it would come from the mother in a interesting way. I'm sure you've seen it, and I'm sure it's very interesting to see.
Yeah.
But I think so that starts to dabble on their behavior. And you did again a wonderful job just breaking myths about their behavior, that they're this just slow, lazy species, and that's not actually the true story. So, could you talk a little bit about that? Maybe why did they get that reputation, and I guess is it true? What is the maybe a normal day of a koala like? And yeah, how should we look at them and what they do?
Yeah, the interesting thing about koalas is that there's quite a lot of quite pervasive underlying myths that we tell about koalas. Obviously, we get the sort of Reddit end stream of the story where People will say they're stoned on the eucalypt leaves that they eat. They're drugged out, because it's true. They are sleepy and they generally are slow moving. So that they sleep up to 90% of their time. A koala's active day could be not much more than half an hour. So, they they pack everything into a short time frame. So that is true. But I guess that's also led to this idea that because they sleep a lot because of the food they eat. So there's this prevailing thought that they sleep a lot and they're slow because their food is low nutrition. They're not getting very much nutrition out of their food supply. Therefore, they have to reduce their energy consumption. Therefore, they sleep a lot. And this has also led to the belief that they have a small brain, that this brain has actually shrunk because of the low level of nutrition in their food. Now, when I was thinking about this story, I was thinking that doesn't really make sense to me. We have a lot of animals that sleep a lot. I've got a cat and it spends 90% of its day asleep.
Same.
Um, Dogs spend a lot of time asleep. Typically, the type of animals that spend a lot of time asleep have a high nutrient diet. So they sleep because they can. They get their food and then they just chill out for the rest of the time. So I thought, well, if this is a low nutrient problem, why is the animal not eating more? Now, it's true. It could be because of the amount of time it takes to digest the food, but nonetheless, when I looked into it, I realized that koalas consume pretty much the same biomass of leaves as any other low nutrient herbivore does, like the same body size goat or sheep will eat about the same amount of food. So I couldn't, and I also thought, well, if it's something to do with digestion, you'd end up with a bigger animal so that it's got more capacity to store leaves. So biologically and evolutionarily, it just didn't make sense to me that they would sleep because they're low in nutrients. And they do seem to get exactly the same nutrient value out of what they eat as any other animal. The gum leaves are low nutrient, but so's grass, so it's no better or worse, not as toxic, but it's probably even harder to digest. So it made me realize that what's going on with the koalas is that they're sleeping because they can. They get up they find an appropriate tree that's got lots of food for them. They climb up the tree, they settle in, they eat their fill, and then they sit around and digest. So why wouldn't you have a sleep? I guess the thing I wanted to think about then was, well, why do other herbivores not sleep? Of course, herbivores on the ground are vulnerable to predation, and their response to predation is to run away. So they have to be awake and alert to watch for predators. So koalas have a different predator strategy. Their predator strategy is to sit quietly and inconspicuously in the trees and hope no one notices them. And they actually are really hard to spot in trees. And they have predators, but they're not quite as exposed to predators as animals are on the ground. So koalas are vulnerable to predators on the ground when they come down from their trees. So dogs are one of their major, predators. But once they're up the tree, they're pretty safe. So they're basically chilling out because they can and relaxing. So that I think unpacks a lot of those things. The other issue about their brain size is also a myth. I think that what happened was people were doing brain measurements on pickled specimens and
Mm.
the tissue had shrunk. And koala brains do shrink when they're preserved. If we look at recent specimens, the brain is pretty much completely normal for their body size. And there's also been MRI scans done now on living animals, and the brain is just a normal size brain. Might have a slightly more, cerebral fluid around the brain, possibly as a protection from falling, and they do have quite sturdy skulls. I've got one here actually. So this is the koala skull.
Oh, how cool.
It's quite a solid little skull, but it is absolutely normal sized for its body size, and the brain cavity is as well. So yeah, there's nothing that unusual about that. So, but that myth actually is not just in popular commentary. It actually does pop up in the scientific literature as
Oh,
well. That myth.
really?
So it's just something people haven't given a great deal of comparative thinking to it, to think why do animals sleep? What makes sense in terms of evolution? And I think that's worth having a closer look at because it does impact on our concept of the other thing, koalas are being stupid. Um,
Right.
I think, I'm really wary about quick comments about intelligence in animals because usually as humans, when we're looking at we talk about intelligence, we're usually thinking about things like us. We're the sort of the gold standard for intelligence in our own perceptions. And so we're unlikely to appreciate the cognitive strategies that other animals use in their environment. And to me, intelligence isn't about our kind of language, communication, problem solving, creativity, any of those things. It's more about flexibility, cognitive flexibility, the ability to come up with new strategies and behaviors in response to um, changing environments. And although koalas might be slow and they might not do a lot in a day, they're not very busy. So it takes a long time for you to collect data on koala behavior. They are very flexible. And we know that because everywhere we look at koalas in different parts of the country, they behave differently. So they're actually doing different things in different places. And I think that's really interesting. We don't really know how koalas find their way through a forest. How do koalas know which trees to go to, which trees to go back to, which trees not to, which trees to avoid? They have a huge range. It takes one koala needs actually a forest the size of an average sports field to support it. So that's a single koala per that large area, and so they're traveling across big distances. And there's lots of questions about how they navigate that. Are they really moving randomly through the environment? I don't think so. I think that would be quite unusual for an animal to do that. But maybe they are. But those are the sorts of questions I think are worth looking at more in terms of koalas, rather than just assuming they're stupid and operating by chance.
Yeah, I that is the perfect example. So I just returned from Tanzania where I had a wonderful 2-week long safari. Also met up with my team that's over there. So I work in conservation tourism. That's what I do professionally. And the difference in behavior was incredible. Just like you said. I mean, I watched firsthand multiple herbivores get eaten. And so by big cats with big teeth. Not just cats, but also, hyenas and all kinds of stuff that their whole goal is to feed themselves. So the difference in behavior that makes total sense. And as you were saying that I had an immediate conservation question that came into mind. It is how often are they coming onto the ground? And when they do, is that when they are the most vulnerable? And if that is that happening now at a higher rate? I'm assuming that deforestation and habitat loss is probably just as big of an issue as it is in Australia, as it is most parts of the world right now. So is that one of the biggest threats that's happening with koalas, or what have you seen with maybe coming down to the ground, and how has that translated into the risk that they are putting themselves into?
Mm, mhm. Yeah, that's definitely they are definitely at their most vulnerable on the ground, and they probably that's always been their greatest predation risk. I mean, they are taken by powerful owls, the big owls
Mm,
that we get in Australian forests.
I love owls.
Yeah, they're
It's so
probably
cool.
I'm sure wedge-tailed eagles, well, they're known to be taken by wedge-tailed eagles. We have quite a lot of big predatory birds, but their major threat is almost certainly when they're on the ground, and particularly mothers with joeys on their back are extremely vulnerable. So, if you think about it, that's probably one of the biggest impacts on population is the breeding rate for koalas. So if you have a predation that's targeting mothers on the ground when they're moving between trees, that's going to have a significant impact on controlling populations or limiting populations. So that's a really interesting feature. And yes, you're right. Changes in habitat are also having a big impact. So we've got increasing deforestation, increasing habitat fragmentation. So koalas have to travel between patches of forest at times, or they're restricted to a single forest. All of the forests are also being degraded, so it's quite common to get clearance through the forest. removal of the understory, those sorts of things, all of which forestry changes, so the types of trees change, all those sorts of things are resulting in koalas being on the ground more, having to travel longer distances that are unsafe. Of course, one of those major fracturing factors in their habitat are roads, and cars are a huge mortality impact on koalas. We get a lot of koalas being hit by cars because they're trying to cross the roads and the freeways, and we keep putting our roads across their roads. So the paths they need to follow are being cut off. And then we've got development. Koalas like to live in similar areas to humans, so or vice versa, really. So humans are moving into those fertile river valleys, forested river valleys, cutting down the trees and building houses, and we get a lot of real estate developments that don't take into account the needs of the local koala population. Very obvious, often advertise the properties as being, you get koalas in the trees, isn't it
Ah,
lovely? Oh, whoops, we've chopped down all the trees, there's no more koalas. So, it's really important that we look at those particular things we're doing and target those as strategies, not removing any remaining native forest logging. Native forest logging and clearing is meant to have been stopped in Australia decades ago, and yet it's still happening because there's too many exemptions and there's not enough, checking and regulation on what's actually going on. And also, making sure that development happens in an appropriate way, that key koala habitats are protected, that feed trees are protected, all of those sorts of things. And particularly protecting forests along river systems is really important because the trees that koalas feed on best, and probably the trees they need to breed, are the ones that are along river systems where the trees are very lush, they're not producing as many toxins, so they're much better for the animals to reproduce with.
thank you for joining me on this wild adventure today. I hope you've been inspired by the incredible stories, insights, and knowledge shared in this episode. To learn more about what you heard, be sure to check out the show notes at rewildology.com. If you enjoyed today's conversation and want to stay connected with the Rewildology community, hit that subscribe button and rate and review the show on your favorite podcast app. I read every comment left across the show's platforms, and your feedback truly does mean the world to me. Also, please follow the show on your favorite social media app, join the Rewildologist Facebook group, and sign up for the weekly Rewildology newsletter. In the newsletter, I share recent episodes, the latest conservation news, opportunities from across the field, and updates from past guests. If you're feeling inspired and would like to make a financial contribution to the show, head on over to rewildology.com and donate directly to the show through PayPal, or purchase a piece of swag to show off your Rewildology love. Remember, rewilding isn't just a concept, it's a call to action. Whether it's supporting a local conservation project, reducing your own impact, or simply sharing the knowledge you've gained today, you have the power to make a difference. A big thank you to the guests that come onto the show and share their knowledge with all of us, and to all of you Rewildology listeners for making the show everything it is today. This is Brooke signing off. Remember, together we will rewild the planet.